Those in the back, can you hear me okay? Is it fine? Loud enough? Okay, I am a part-time target, so it's not completely this outsider coming in. And I did work for John Wilson one summer reunion, and that's how I got started on this project that dealt with the Freedmen's Colony on Roanoke Island. Today, though, I'm going to talk about the small Freedmen's camp that was on Hatteras. First, though, let me thank Danny Couch, Drew Pullman, and Dennis Scher for inviting me to speak at this conference. And I must tell you that when they asked me to speak, I did hesitate because I do not claim to be an expert on Hatteras Freedmen. I had read about some of the contributions of some of the contrabands to the work on Hatteras when I was researching my book about Roanoke Island and the Freedmen's Colony, but I hadn't spent any time studying the Freedmen on Hatteras. So then when I finally did get into the research, I discovered that it really is a challenge to find a lot of substantial information, and I'm still no expert on the Hatteras Freedmen. But having said that, today I will share what I uncovered in the research. Let me open by noting that I put a handout on each place, and it basically has the outline of my talk and an illustration from Harper's Weekly, which I will remove a little bit later in the talk. And you'll also note that part of the title of my talk, The Germ of a Larger Civil Cultivation and a Higher Civilization, comes from an 1862 article in an anti-slavery newspaper. The article focused on members of the extended Tillett family, which had fled to Hatteras from Roanoke Island, where they had been slaves. I like to use that phrase, and particularly thought it was appropriate today, because it is heavy with positive expectations. The author, who was a northerner visiting the Tilletts in their cabins in Hatteras, was very impressed by this family. His description of them suggests that he believed that the Tilletts, and by logical extension, all of the free people on Hatteras, were on the cusp of something grander than themselves, grander than what was beginning to occur on Hatteras. I will return to these Tilletts later in the talk when I'll spend a bit more time discussing them. First, though, let me note that my talk is going to be very straightforward. I'll talk about the national context, how the Hatteras Freedmen settlements fits in with other Freedmen settlements during and after the Civil War, the local context, the Freedmen themselves, where they were from, how they got to Hatteras, their work and leisure, the relationships between the Freedmen and the white soldiers, the enlistment of the Freedmen in General Edward Wild's African Brigade, and finally, I'll conclude with my assessment of the national significance of the Hatteras Freedmen settlement. So let's begin with a little description of the national context, Freedmen camps at other Union encampments. When the Civil War opened, there were approximately 4 million enslaved people in the South. 4 years later, close to 500,000 slaves were living in areas held by federal forces, many of them in freedmen's camps that were on the outskirts of Union occupations, that is, former slaves. Generally, within a few days of Union occupation, slaves started to stream into the areas of the Union encampments seeking freedmen. Word spread, others came, and the camps of these, and the encampments of former slaves grew larger and larger. Following the precedent set by Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe in May 1861, Union officers considered the fleeing slaves to be contraband of war. Although there's no evidence that Butler himself initiated the term contrabands instead of another term such as slave refugees, it did not take long for the Union soldiers and the press to use this term to refer to former slaves and any free blacks that fled to Union camps. In most places, contrabands was used for a couple of years, but then in the summer of 1863, most, including women and children, were referred to as freedmen. Therefore, I use that term for both women and children, and as well as men. Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 had something to do with the change in terminology, but I don't think it was coincidence that the name changed in practice about the same time that the Union government opened the way for enlistment of black men in the Union Army. The earliest contraband camps began to coalesce in the Tidewater area of Virginia and the District of Columbia in May 1861, and then later at Port Royal Island and Hilton Head Island on November 1861. Obviously, the beginning of the camp on Hatteras was somewhat in between those. Former slaves started together near the Union camp at Hatteras in the late summer and fall of 1861, and near Union headquarters on Roanoke Island after the battle in February 1862. We don't exactly know how many freedmen's camps or even colonies existed. We know that based on research coming out of the Freedmen and Southern Society Project at the University of Maryland, there were probably 100 large freedmen's camps, and there were probably at least 100 other temporary small gatherings that were at various places at various times. They were situated wherever there was a strong Union presence, a strong occupation, just outside the District of Columbia, at various points along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, at a number of locations in Kentucky and Tennessee, and up the Mississippi from New Orleans to Cairo, Illinois. There were large ones and there were small ones. Some were urban and some were on large plantations or farms that had been confiscated from their owners. Given the number of camps and the number of contrabands and later freedmen, it is truly amazing that most people still know very little about them. Once the numbers in these camps grew large enough to bother or concern the military authorities, who feared that concentrations of people would lead to outbreaks of disease or interfere with military discipline, the Army usually stepped in to help organize. Often they provided some of the contrabands and later the freedmen with rations. In some places the government provided housing or helped them build their own houses. The local generals also usually appointed someone to superintend the growing settlements. These superintendents in turn worked with freedmen's aid associations in the north to provide clothing, tools and implements, medicines, etc., often requiring the people to pay. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but most of the time the Army also employed, the men at least, and then some of the women were also employed by individual soldiers. They didn't always get paid, but they were employed. Several of these associations, most predominantly the American Missionary Association, the National Freedmen's Relief Association, and the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, sent teachers and ministers south to set up schools and offer assistance. They saw this as a grand opportunity to extend the missionary efforts that they had been sending over into the Middle East and other places, or even out to Indian reservations to the south. By the spring of 1863, the government had determined that several of the large freedmen camps would be colonies, places to which the government could actually bring families of slaves to live with. Men were serving in the Union Army. Obviously, Rock Island was one of those. And just to show you how it operated in North Carolina, in April of 1863, Major General John G. Foster, who was commander of the 18th Army Corps, appointed the Reverend Horace James, a congregational minister from Worcester, Massachusetts, who was also serving as chaplain in Massachusetts 25th, to be superintendent of all the blacks in the Department of North Carolina. That was his official title. He was in charge of the freedmen in Beaufort, Hatteras Banks, New Bern, Plymouth, Roanoke Island, and Washington. He had strong connections to the American Missionary Association and the National Freedmen's Relief Association, and through them began to send teachers to North Carolina in late summer of 1863. The first teachers, as a matter of fact, arrived in New Bern in late July 1863. The first teacher to arrive on Roanoke Island was Elizabeth James, who was Horace James' cousin, and she arrived in October of 1863. And I always like to point out that that was 15 months after the freedmen on Roanoke Island began to congregate and create their own community there. So to a certain extent, the missionaries were late-coming meddlers. We did not have the late-coming meddlers on Hatteras, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But let's turn to Hatteras. At the time of the battle, the population of all of the Hatteras banks was supposedly about 1,200, including close to 100 slaves or enslaved people. Approximately 600 people, including most of the enslaved, lived in the Cape Hatteras district, west of the lighthouse. At that time, Hatteras was a study in contradictions. The area was very sparsely settled, and yet, as historian John Barrett has noted, in 1861, Hatteras was one of the busiest ports in North Carolina, with an annual tonnage that exceeded Beaufort and almost equaled that of Wilmington. I find that difficult to believe, but if John Barrett said it, I guess it must be true. It was definitely not a place that was easy to make a living or to live. In early September 1861, after the Battle of Hatteras, a writer in the Charleston Mercury very gleefully reported about the, quote, unpleasant situation, unquote, that Union soldiers would encounter on Hatteras. And I go on to quote, "It is a dreary, barren spot composed chiefly of sand. During the latter summer and early fall months, it abounds with mosquitoes, remarkable alike for their size and bloodthirstiness. And during the winter, the winds from old Neptune sweep across the island with a fury and keenness against which the thickest of garments offer but poor and inadequate protection, unquote. Some things haven't changed, especially mosquitoes. Soldiers also frequently commented negatively on the Hatteras conditions themselves. In his 1883 History of the 27th Massachusetts, William Derby, who had been stationed at Hatteras, wrote, and I quote, "If ever our country is in a paroxysm of wrath, should desire a penal colony for the punishment of criminals, some Siberia or Botany Bay, where the roar of waters from headlong heights howl and hiss in endless torture, there is no place on this globe better fitted for that than Hatteras." End quote. Oliver Bosnichell's 1895 reminiscences of his experience on Hatteras as part of the 48th Pennsylvania was similar. He noted that no one would have chosen to live on Hatteras, not even for a seaside resort, he said. He went on to note, and I quote, "Some jocose soldier suggested that it was the last spot made. The creation having been accomplished in a week, there had been no time to plant grass."